Alright guys, today we're going to talk about dependency injection service lifetimes, scoped, transient, and singleton. And through examples, we'll try to demonstrate the difference between the three. So let's get started. I'm just going to start with a new project, and we'll choose ASP NET Core MVC app. This is a bit of an overkill for this demo project, but it will help us get started really quickly. So let's just do that, and we'll call this DI service lifetime. Cool. Um, Click next. Um, I'm using .NET 5.0 as the target framework. I will take this check mark off just to make things a little bit less complex. We'll just use HTTP, and then we will create our project. And while this project is being created, maybe we can take a look at this service lifetime slide. Alright, so this is just a basic overview of the service lifetimes. So let's start with the scoped service. A scoped service is created once per client request, and it can maintain a state for the lifetime of that request. So for example, let's say we have a number counting service, and it stores a private field that's initialized at a value of 0, and it exposes a method that allows you to increase this number by a value of 1. So if we have an HTTP request and we call upon this number counting service that's been registered with the scope lifetime, and if we call it multiple times, the first time we call it and increase the number, is going to increase from 0 to 1. If within that same request, if we call upon it again and call that increase number method, it's going to increase from 1 to 2, call it again, 2 to 3. But as soon as that request is complete, so is the scoped service, or this instance of the scoped service. So the next time, if there's another HTTP request and we call upon the service again, again the initial value will be 0, and then we can increase it however many times we want within that request. Now transient service, it's quite different from the scope service, as in it can't really maintain any state. So if we're looking at, and it creates a brand new instance every time you request it. So if we look at that same example with the HTTP request, it doesn't matter how many times we call this service. Let's just say we register the same number counting service with the transient lifetime. It doesn't matter how many times we call upon it. It's going to always start with the value of 0, and then if we call that method, increase number method, it's going to just increase to 1, and then if we call upon the service again, it's going to again be set at 0, and then we can only increase it to 1, and so on. Singleton, on the other hand, is completely, almost completely opposite than transient. It's created the first time they requested within the application's lifetime, and it maintains a global state. So every time you call upon it after the first time, it knows, or it can maintain a state from the previous request. So if we were thinking about that same example, it kind of, if we're looking at an HTTP request, it kind of behaves like scope service within that request. So it will increase that number from 0 to 1 to 2 and so on. But not only that, after that request has ended, and then we start a new HTTP request, and if we call this singleton service again, it will start that count from the previous values, previous requests values. So let's just say we ended the previous HTTP request with the value of 3 at the end. For the next HTTP request, if we call the singleton service again, it will start that initial value at 3 and then go to 4, 5, and 6, and so on. Now I know this can be quite confusing, So we will work through an actual example and see the differences very clearly, and I think that will clarify things. But before we do that, I think we need to have a plan of attack. And the way we're going to structure our projects um, is is basically we'll set up three interfaces and we'll name them after the service lifetimes, so scope, transient, singleton, and we'll implement them in the three different services, um, and they'll be named after their lifetimes as well, scope, transient, and singleton. We'll register them in the DI container, which will allow us to inject them into the controller and make it available for us in the actions. So in the actions, we'll call upon all three services and then try to manipulate the state of the services um, and then see the results in the views. Um, and I think that will help us clarify the differences between these three services, and we'll see the results in the views in a table format side by side, and I think that'll be pretty clear. Okay, so let's start with our example. Alright, so let's switch to the Solution Explorer, and we'll add a folder called Services, and we will add another folder within Services called iServices, which will have all our interfaces. And let's just add a base interface that we'll inherit from, just to make things a little bit easier. And we'll call this iPermission service. Okay, and then let's make sure we add public to the front, and then let's declare the methods here. So it will have a void get net set permission. I will take a parameter of string secret, and then we will also have get permission that will return a string. And that's it for this interface. Now we'll add three different interfaces, and they will have the name of the three different service lifetimes, just so that we can follow them clearly. So let's add those interfaces now. We'll call the first one iPermission service scoped, and we'll inherit from. Let's make sure this has a public in front as well, and we'll inherit from iPermission service, and let's just make sure. Okay, perfect. And then we will add the other interfaces as well, so transient and singleton. So let's do that now. Transient iPermission service transient, public, and inherit from iPermission service, and then add another interface. So I think we did transient and scope, so singleton is next. iPermission service singleton, and we'll give it a public modifier, and then inherit from iPermission service as well. And that's it. We're not really adding anything into this interfaces. We're just inheriting from iPermission services. So let's start implementing the interfaces. We will add a class here called permission service scoped, and this will implement the permission service scoped. If I just click on the item with the red squiggly line, the interface, I can click on this yellow light bulb, implement interface, and we'll add the logic here as well while we're here. So we'll just set a private um, string um, secret called as admin, and then we'll set another private string permission, and we'll say read. Okay, and the get permission will just simply return the permission, and then set permission will take the parameter of secret, and we'll check here if the secret equals to the secret, so this admin here, and if they're equal, then we will allow the permission of modify. We'll set the permission to modify, and then if someone requests to get permission, they'll have modify permission. So that's it for the logic for this service, and let's just take this part of the code, and we'll now replicate it for Transient and Singleton. So let's add a permission service Singleton, permission service Singleton, and again we'll implement the iPermission service Singleton, and we don't have to implement the interface here, we can just paste the code here and that will take care of the implementation. And then we will move on to the Transient service. So let's add a class called permission service Transient, and this will implement iPermission service Transient, and then we'll paste the code here again, and that should be it. So there are no errors right now, which is great. Now we can go ahead and register this services under the DI container, which is located in the startup. So if we look at this comment above configure services method, it states this method gets called by the runtime. Use this method to add services to the container, and that's exactly what we're doing here. We will add a scoped service. Services.add scoped, and we'll specify the interface type and the implementation type. So our interface type is iPermission service scoped, and the implementation type is permission service scoped. Now we could register a scoped service with just the implementation type, just like this, and that will also work. But the reason we generally see this approach is because we typically want our consumer of the services to depend on abstractions, which is the interfaces, and not the concrete classes like permission service scoped. This just allows for easier testing, and we can mock easily based on the interface. But anyway, let's add the other services. So services.add transient, and we will specify our interface and the implementation. Do the same thing for Singleton. Alright, and we've named the interfaces and the classes after the lifetimes that they will be registered, or they're being registered under, just so that we can follow the examples easily. You can obviously name them however you choose. So now that we've registered these classes and interfaces under our DI container, we'll now be able to inject them into the controller. So let's go into our controller and just let's remove this logger service. And alright, so let's inject our services into this controller now. So we'll set up some private variables or private fields. Private IS permission service scoped. Call it scope service. Permission service singleton. Call it singleton service. Let's prefix this names with an underscore. And private permission service transient. Call it transient service. Or transient service. Let's change this to singleton service. Alright. And then let's inject the instances of those services into the home controller. So you can just pass in the services as a parameter to the constructor. So permission service scoped service, singleton service, and permission service transient service. And then let's set this private fields with the parameters that being passed into this constructor, so this services. And what's responsible for passing this into the controller at runtime? Well, that's the DI container that we just registered our services under at startup. So right here. And that's one of the benefits of using interfaces as well, is that because we're using the abstraction, at any time we can switch the implementation. So for example, we can create another scoped service that's that implements permission service scoped with a little bit different logic, and that would still work. We just have to switch the implementation here. That's all. Okay, so let's go back to our controller and let's set this private fields. So scope service equals to scope service transient, this transient, and singleton. So now we can take advantage of the services, or make use of the services that are being injected into the controller. So we can go into our action and make use of them. So let's actually create another action here. So iAction result access, and this will take secret, and then we will pass that into our service set permission method. So scope service dot set permission secret, and we'll do the same thing for transient, and we'll do it for singleton as well. Alright, and then we'll just return the view. So something we'll need to provide the secret to the access view. So let's set that up first. So we can set up a form in that index view, and then that will post to the access view. So let's go to the index view. So right here, and let's wipe this out, and we'll set up a form here. So let's do form ASP action access, so that will post to the access page. So method equals to post, and let's set up a div, give it a bootstrap class of form group. Oops. Form group. Great. And let's let's allow user to enter the secret here. So we'll add an input with a class of form control, type of text. I'll give it a name of secret, and let's add a placeholder as well. We'll say enter secret for ability to modify. Okay, and then let's add a button here as well for submit. Submit, and do a class of button primary, and then we'll name this submit as well. Okay, so now this form is ready to submit to the Access page. Let's save that and let's go to our home controller. So once the user enters a secret, submits the form, it should go into this Access action and hit this or pass the secret to all the services, and then we'll return afterward we'll return the user to the view. We won't really get the permissions here and pass the results to the view. We want to actually directly access the results in the Access view, just so that we can kind of see how the different services work. And they'll be a little bit more clear once I demonstrate the example. So let's go into let's add a view here, and we'll call this, we'll just set an empty view, and we'll call this Access. Alright, so let's delete all of this stuff, and let's add a table here. So let's do table class, and then we'll give it a bootstrap class of table bordered, and let's add a row. Let's give it some headers of scoped, and Singleton, and Transient. Okay, cool. And then we'll make another row and make a cell. So here we will pass in our scope permission, and then another row. This would be Singleton permission, and then here we'll pass in Transient permission, just so that we can compare the values here. So so let's now, to be able to see the result of the permission, let's now inject the services directly here. So we can do using di service lifetime dot services I services, and then we can inject the scoped service. We'll call this scoped. Inject Singleton service, call it Singleton, and then inject Transient service and call it Transient. Great. And let's get the permissions here as well, and then we can replace this this string here with actual value. So let's go up here and let's get the permissions. We'll call it scoped permission, and then it will be scoped dot get permission, and then Singleton get permission, Transient dot get permission. Okay, and then here we can just call on or set the table cells with the actual variable. So scope permission, um, Singleton permission, and transient permission. So just to have another view to compare this view with, we can take this code and then copy it to another view. We can use privacy for it. Privacy was automatically added when we initiated the project, so we can just go into that. I just wiped out what was in there already, and then I can paste that code here and then save. So privacy view and then the access view has the same exact code, and it'll make much more sense when we actually run the project and navigate to this 2 pages on why we're setting this up this way. So let's just start the project and we'll get started. Now, before we enter something into this form, let's go back to our project and let's look into our access action. Let's actually put a breakpoint in line 33. Our expectation is that once we enter the correct secret or any secret into that form, it's going to get passed into this home controller, into this access action, and now it's being passed into, or it'll get passed into all 3 services: scoped, singleton, and transient. The reason that we're not just calling the get permission and passing it back, passing the result to the view, is because we want to see if the instance that's being injected into this home controller here, is this the same instance as the ones that are being injected into the access view here? So the scoped, singleton, and transient. If we remember our slide, what we're expecting is that the scoped service will retain a state because the request coming into this access, remember what we set up when we set up the form in index. This is a post request to access. So once it hits the home controller and this access action and returns the view, it's all part of the same request. So expectation is that the scoped permission, because we're modifying it here, it will remain modified when we view the result in the access view. So if we provide the right secret, this will change the permission to modify. In access, when we're viewing the result, this should say modify. Same thing with singleton. Singleton maintains state. It's just created the first time that it's requested, and it maintains the same instance throughout the application's lifetime. So until we stop this application, it should remember that we have modified the permission through the secret. And for transient, it should be a brand new instance every time. So even though we're modifying it here, in access, when we inject this transient permission service, this should be read, because if we look at permission service transient, once the secret gets passed into it, then it changes to modify. But because it will be a brand new instance in the access view, and we never call the set permission in the access view, that it would mean that the permission would be just the default permission of read. So that's our expectation. Transient should be read, scoped should be modify, and singleton should be modify as well. So let's go back to our home controller. Let's go back into the form and let's enter admin. So it's, oops, and then let's click submit. And if we hover our mouse over the secret, it is admin indeed. So this should equal to the private secret variable in the permission services, and so the permission should, so right here it's equal to the secret, and if it is, then the permission should change to modify at this point. Okay, so let's see how it actually behaves. So let's continue, and just like I've what we expected, the scope is modified because it's part of the same request. Singleton is also modified because this is really just maintaining a single instance throughout multiple injections throughout the applications really. And transient is read because it's a brand new instance every time. Now, how do we differentiate between these two though, the scoped and singleton, because currently they're both at modify. So to look at it clearly, all we have to do is just navigate to privacy page, because if you remember, we replicated the code for the access page, the view, into privacy as well. So this is the privacy view. The only difference is that if we go into home controller and look at our privacy, we're not really calling any set permission here. So the set permission was once called in the access view, but in privacy there's no logic to modify the different permissions. So if we go back into our lifetime, our website here, click on privacy, the expectations will be this will be set to read because it's a brand new request, and so this will be a brand new instance, the scope service. Singleton, and because we haven't modified the permission during our get request to privacy, as we've seen in the home controller privacy, there's no logic there. This should just be reset back to the default private variable, which is read. Singleton, this should continue to maintain a state of privacy or of modify, because it's the same instance that's being used throughout the application. Doesn't matter where you inject it. Transient is again completely opposite of singleton. It's new instance every time, so even when we navigate to privacy, this should continue to say read. So let's click on privacy, and if you notice that scoped has switched back to read, singleton to modify, and transient is back to read. So I hope that clarifies the difference between these three different lifetimes. Scoped is scoped to the request, so it can maintain a state for the lifetime of the request. On a new request, it's a brand new instance. Singleton service can maintain state throughout the once it's instantiated. Once we have injected it once and modified its state, that state you can access for the entire application's lifetime. It's a single instance that's being used no matter how many times you inject it. Transient, it's a brand new instance every time. And I hope it gives you some clues on how to use these three different types of lifetimes in your own applications. Thank you for watching.